Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of July's BV podcast, your taste of things rural in our lovely county of Dorset. I'm Jenny Devitt.
And hello again from me, Terry Bennett.
Only a couple of your letters in this first July episode of the BV podcast. We'll be hearing from wildlife writer and regular contributor to the BV, Jane Adams, about the amazing crab spider, something you might or might not have spotted on some of the flowers in your garden.
I speak to nutritionalist Karen Geary about her recent article questioning whether there may be a carcinogenic effect of eating too much protein in our diet.
Farmer Andrew Livingston is fed up with fly tipping and clearing up other people's mess and feels this is a problem that's got worse in recent years. We start, as ever, with the letter from our editor, Laura.
As I sat writing the editor's letter this month, the polling stations were just closing, and the country sat, snoozed, poised, waiting for what I thought was an inevitable landslide of a night. Living in Dorset, we enjoy one of the most beautiful and tranquil environments in the country, but hiding behind the idyllic facade of thatched roofs and high hedgerows lies an issue that has been overlooked, avoided and ignored by successive governments. It's the rural tax. It's not a formal levy. Rather, it's a cumulative burden of high living costs and limited access to essential services in rural areas. It's always tough to be short of money, but it's far tougher when you can't easily access social groups, schools, affordable supermarkets, doctors, or even regular public transport. Living in a rural area is significantly more challenging than an urban living for those on a low income. Healthcare access is a fundamental right, and yet many in our rural communities struggle with long travel times to reach medical appointments, and this places a strain on individuals and families and highlights a broader systemic neglect. The scarcity of public transport isn't any easier to solve, but for those without private vehicles, the lack of reliable transport options can lead to social isolation and severely limited economic opportunities, especially in areas also poorly supplied with fast broadband. The next government must consider these rural issues. While it is of course necessary to cater to the majority, continually focusing on urban areas leaves rural parts of the country behind. Tailored support for rural economies is an essential step towards creating a more equitable society. Policies should recognise the distinct needs of rural areas and not adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. Dorset needs a government that listens to and acts upon the concerns of rural residents. Our rural communities deserve nothing less.
And now, your letters.
Will Hiscock writes via Facebook on the subject of Liscombe Farm, which featured in last month's BV magazine. The farmland purchased by DWT was 800 acres total, and the only productive agriculture done was on 300 acres of low-input grassland. The farm has been organic for 30 years and has had the lowest inputs of purely cattle dung applied to it of any farm in the pool catchment, as proved by it having the lowest score on the nitrate leaching tool. DWT and Natural England used a different model, as if it were farmed in a conventional way. They use this model to forecast nitrogen net benefit to the harbour. This farm has never applied an optimum level of nitrogen. Furthermore, the slurry applied to the large area surrounding it remains, as they've not lowered the stock numbers of surrounding farmers. In terms of stock, they removed 100 sheep and 50 beef cattle, which they intend to replace to holistically graze the site. The community wholeheartedly support a nature reserve being in the middle of the Dorset AONB and being funded with DWT money. The public should be aware that government spent £5 million of their money, and if they want support from local farmers, they should tell the full picture. This will have negligible effects on Poole Harbour, and many very qualified people agree with nitrate saving being farcical, but it will undoubtedly be a gain to the wildlife in the area. £5 million may have been better spent at Wessex Water, where human slurry gets pumped into rivers.
Sweet Sorrow is the next letter from Fraser Wilson. How wonderful to discover this passionate play at the Exchange, presented by SNADS, by SNADS. Not one of their hilarious pantomimes, farces or murder mysteries, but an exploration into bereavement. If that put you off going, what a shame. The audience was rapt, much laughter and a few tears as we witnessed a family joking around, then falling apart and finally recovering. The cast played with absolute conviction, transporting us to their real world with sincerity. I must pick out Hazel Parrott and Tom Selby, who were particularly impressive, being so young, grounded in the reality of difficult teenage journeys through this splendid piece. Scene setting via upstage film projection, denoting not only location but the quips and retorts of texting, was an inspired creation. A most tasteful touch was an aerial panning of Christchurch estuary, with the message of death conveyed by the music of Fauré's beautiful In Paradisum. Can one be entertained by tears and sad emotion? Yes. It was a compellingly enjoyable deepening of life around us, and, what's more, the actors told me that they enjoyed rehearsals immensely, and it showed. Wildlife writer Jane Addams' article in the July BV is about crab spiders, which I personally find very pretty. At least, the only ones I've ever seen are, because they look very like the flowers they use to hide on, being the same colour, where they sit patiently and wait for an unsuspecting pollinating insect to land, because a crab spider's disguise is extremely good.
Oh, they're amazing, because they can, yes, well, crab spiders are one of the only crab spiders that can actually change their colour to suit their flower, as long as it is in the range of being yellow or white. But they have the ability to, change colour so that they can sit inside the flower and you literally cannot see them. And then they just sit there in wait for an unsuspecting fly to land on the flower.
So, and then they pounce, of course.
Yes, they're an ambush spider rather than having a web.
And of course you would, as you say, you don't see them unless they happen to move.
No, I mean, you really, really have to study the flowers to be able to see them. I've been looking at insects before now on flowers, pollinators, and then realised that there was a crab spider there, or wondered why a fly was upside down and sort of thinking, what earth is that doing? And it had actually been caught by a crab spider, but even looking at it, I couldn't actually see the crab spider because it was so well camouflaged.
That's amazing, isn't it? In your article you say that crab spiders can see colour.
I mean, I've said see, it's sort of perceive colour, so I'm presuming, I mean, they have got 8 eyes, but not all their eyes do the same thing. So I'm presuming that some of their eyes perceive colour, and then they actually secrete a liquid pigment into their body's outer cells to match whatever flower they're actually sitting on. And it takes quite a long time for them to change colour, so if they have been on a white flower and they sort of change to a yellow flower, it can take them sort of up to 25 days to actually change to yellow. Whereas if they change from a yellow to a white flower, it only takes them about 6 days to change.
Nevertheless, that's quite a long time to go hungry, isn't
it? I presume they're catching things in between them. I have seen crab spiders sort of sitting underneath the flowers, waiting, laying in wait sort of underneath. So I presume it just gives them that extra edge when they are trying to catch things.
And if the spider is underneath the flower, presumably then it detects the vibrations of the insect that lands.
Yes, I imagine they do.
Rush out and snatch it.
Yeah.
Now that's fascinating. You say that they can see the colour of the flower that they're on, and they can change. So that kind of implies that it's a conscious decision to change colour, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, I think that's one of the amazing things about them, is that they are physically, it's like when you see those octopuses and things like that actually sort of changing their colour depending on the surface that they're on. I mean, but you just don't expect it from sort of a spider somehow. But they do it, so...
And of course they're called crab spiders because of the way they sit there with those forelegs shaped like a crab's pincers.
Yeah, so it's their very front legs, their first set of legs, because they've got 8 altogether, but those first ones are longer than the rest of their legs, and they are sort of crab leg shaped. So they are longer and more for sort of jumping out and actually catching things.
They've got claws on the end of those legs, have they?
No, I don't think so. I think they just wrap themselves around things, and then obviously they do inject venom into their prey. So that's their way of actually immobilising whatever it is that they catch.
And like so many other spiders, turn the inside of the prey into soup.
Yeah,
All
so
not very nice.
Yeah, well, they inject a digestive enzyme into the actual insect, and then it, yeah, as you say, it basically makes it into a soup which they then suck out. Leaving the insect as if it was a lot, they leave the shell of the insect completely. So sometimes you might get caught out seeing an insect on a flower and think, that hasn't moved for a long time, and it's actually because it's just the shell of it.
It's just the
husk.
The husk.
Yeah.
Now they also, just like crabs, they move sideways.
Yeah, they can do. Yeah, that is another thing. That they can run sideways, which is... I don't know whether that is unusual in the spider families. I mean, we've got 650 species of spiders alone in the UK. So even in the crab spiders, although we're talking about a particular one, which is, I'm not going to pronounce this properly, Misumena vatia, which is particular to the south of England, there's actually another sort of 27 species of crab spider that live in the UK.
But none of them as pretty as the
I
flower
don't
crab
know.
spider.
I haven't looked at the rest of them. I expect there are some other ones which are, but these ones are the most common, especially in Dorset. So you're most likely to see them, in your garden if you have a really good look at your flowers that you've got, especially the sort of open flowers where they can sort of lie in wait.
Yes, daisy-like flowers, things like
Yeah,
that.
yes, daisies and alliums and things like that. Anything really that's getting a lot of insects coming to them. But you will get them woodland edges, sort of open scrub, even in grasslands. I mean, with wildflowers and things like that.
And now, you've said that they're called crab spiders and they can move sideways like a crab, but they're not related, are they?
No. Well, yeah, no. I mean, I was going to say that they are an arachnid, so they are a family all of their own. They're not an insect. They have 8 legs and the insects have 6. Crustaceans actually are different again, and they can sometimes have 10 legs. I don't know how many they usually have. I'm nowhere near, I'm not an expert on spiders, but I'm definitely not an expert on crustaceans and crabs.
Now, Jane, just to come back to colour for a moment. Do the crab spiders rely on their prey seeing different colours in the spectrum to the colours that they see?
Oh, I don't know. You've got me there.
I was just wondering, can their prey actually see the spider? Presumably not.
No, I'm presuming not. So, I mean, I know that a lot of insects see sort of in infrared, don't they? And they sort of, they see completely differently than we do. So I would presume that even when they're changing colour, they are changing colour in order to suit not being able to be seen by insects rather than us.
So the unfortunate insect that happens to land on the same flower as a crab spider, which is waiting for its lunch to drop by, would just see exactly the same colour as the flower, but not detect the shape of the spider.
Yes, I presume so. I mean, I know my husband, when I say I'm fascinated by spiders, he says, oh no, they're awful things. They're sitting there and they're eating the pollinators and stuff like that. And in some ways I can understand people not liking spiders, but there's something about crab spiders, especially the flower crab spider, that just is fascinating to me. I mean, it's just its whole way of going about living. And the fact that actually the spiders, the flower crab spiders that we see, that you're most likely to see, are going to be females, because actually the male crab spider can't change colour, and he is tiny, like a lot of male spiders, compared with the female. So he is actually pretty wary when he goes anywhere near the female, because she is just as likely to go for him as she is any other insect, or any insect.
Spiders do have that unfortunate characteristic, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, he's only literally sort of 3 or 4 millimeters in size. I mean, tiny compared with her. She can be up to sort of at least, well, double or more than that.
So what you have to hope is that should you happen to be reincarnated as a crab spider,
You want to be a female.
You want to be the female and not the little male.
No, definitely not.
Wildlife writer Jane Addams on the crab spider.
Karen Geary of Amplify Nutrition is a local nutritionalist who writes regularly for the BV magazine. Her article in the July edition is entitled "Can Eating Too Much Protein Really Cause Cancer?" With a title like that, I had to catch up with her to find out a little bit more. Karen, thank you for joining us on the BV magazine podcast. You've written a very interesting article in the July edition of the magazine about the role of protein in cancer, or whether in fact too much protein can promote cancerous cells within the body. This is quite a difficult area, isn't it? I mean, there's not full agreement amongst professionals as to the validity of this. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's fair. I mean, if you look at the research, it's very mixed. I think it's really hard to draw conclusions. What I get concerned about more than anything else with people with cancer is they're actually not eating enough protein. If you are a cancer sufferer and you're really not in the mood for eating very much, one of the issues is to get enough nutrients in the body to start with. It's actually quite hard to get enough protein into the diet. If you're not a cancer sufferer and you're looking at eating the best possible diet, there are people that really like to mainline protein, particularly somebody like me. I do a lot of weight training, so I eat a lot of it. Am I afraid of it? No, I'm not. Do I make sure it's good quality? Yes. So what I would say as a rule of thumb is if you're going to eat a lot of protein, eat good stuff. I'm not talking about ham, bacon, sausage rolls, that sort of protein. I'm talking about lean chicken, fish, that sort of protein, and protein from pulses. That's probably a good rule of thumb and a middle ground. Whereas if you're eating 300 grams of processed protein a day, I'm not sure that it's the smartest thing to have. Does that make sense?
It does. Just let's go back to the basics here. There are certain studies and certain reports that say that by eating an elevated level of protein, that in itself could promote cancerous cell development. So in other words, don't eat too much protein because you'll get cancer. Are you knocking down that supposition? Are you challenging that effectively?
No, I'm saying I don't think we know. I mean, I do support cancer patients, and I would not put an elevated level of protein in their diet. So I would be quite moderate about it. So what I'm saying is maybe, but the evidence would say is we don't really know. If you want to go on the safe side, you would not want to put an elevated amount of protein in the diet, but we must not undereat protein. That's more important, especially as we get older. So it's about finding the middle ground.
What you're saying then, recommended dietary allowance, the all-important RDA, is 0.8 grams per kilogram of weight of protein intake. So we're talking quite small amounts, even for an adult who is maybe 80 kilos. And you're saying that's a little bit on the low side.
I think it's the minimum. I would say in my experience, it's probably not enough to maintain muscle. I would look to at least 1 gram per kilo. So if you weigh 60 kilos, I'd be at least 60 grams a day. I'd actually go more if you're healthy and of normal weight. What I see a lot, and this is not necessarily in people with cancer, is elderly people under eating protein. They start to lose weight as they get older. You're losing muscle, so you're getting frail, and often they're happy because they're losing weight for the first time in their life. They're losing weight because we lose our appetite. That's the route to frailty, which is not a good strategy. And then if you get cancer on top of it, then you can find yourself in a hole quite quickly. I would say 1 gram. What does that look like? Let's talk about a palmful with each meal. So what's a palmful of protein? That's 3 pieces of protein a day. That probably gets you to your 1 gram per kilo of body weight a day, if you want to look at it quite simply. So people like to measure it and weigh, that's fine. But using palmfuls is a good rule of thumb, 3 a day.
The studies that we've been talking about here that suggest there is some kind of link between cancer and excess protein intake, can you tell us a little bit about them? Tell me what you think is a little bit unstable or unsteady in their assumptions.
If you take a big step back on nutrition studies, they're fraught with error, because unless you've got somebody sitting in a lab and you're feeding them a controlled diet over a long period of time, you're relying on what people are reporting to you from diary entries. So the basic premise of a lot of nutrition studies is they're either flawed because it's hard to control what they're eating and the quality of what they're eating, or they're based on rodents. A lot of studies are mouse studies. When you break that down a little bit further, what is inside that? Is it protein causing the problem, or are they loading it alongside carbohydrate or chow, as they would feed a mouse? So a high chow diet alongside protein. So you don't really know what the whole thing is. So when you look at nutrition studies, it's easy to try and sort of narrow it down into the kind of the single issue. And it's never really about that, which is why it's always controversial about, is red meat good or bad? Because you don't know what else the person's eating. They might be eating a high grain diet alongside it with a lot of fat, or they may be eating poor quality red meat, processed meat. So that's why it gets frustrating for people when people like me say, we don't know, because we don't. Because unless you've put somebody in a lab for 10 years and feed them a perfect diet and control it in that way and record everything, you really just don't know what's going on around. You've also got the environment. You know, cancer isn't just necessarily a function of what we eat. It's our environment, it's in our genes. There are lots of lifestyle cancers that we know about in terms of obesity driven and things like that. But it's not necessarily just about what we're putting in our mouth.
Okay, so lots of factors involved. You go on to make the point in there that for people who do have cancer already, it is important that they maintain their protein levels, because that, of course, supports good muscle development, or ensures that they keep the muscles that they already have. And that is vitally important when you're undergoing treatment for cancer.
Yes, protein intake needs will ordinarily increase a bit after surgery. So as part of the recovery phase, protein is a really important nutrient to help with healing. So that might be a good time to have a little bit more than normal to help with the repair. But generally, you're really talking around 1 gram per kilo up to 1.4 grams per kilo, depending upon the individual and their needs, and can you figure that out with the individual involved. I think what is quite dangerous is when the patient is really suffering and losing a lot of weight. Those that are suffering with cancer, often their dietitians will give them lots of the nutrient drinks and things, and that's all about making sure they're getting a high caloric intake of whatever type, whether it's good or bad, just to make sure that they're not losing weight, because once you get a cancer patient losing weight, you can quite quickly deteriorate. So how you feed yourself during treatment and recovery, and it's not necessarily about protein, it's about making sure you're getting enough fibre in, because there are side effects from drugs like constipation and things like that. But yeah, making sure that you're getting a good nutrient intake during treatment and recovery phase is really important, and protein plays a part in that.
And remind us, where are the best places to get protein from? And you've already alluded to that a little. Presumably not at the local fried chicken outlet. That wouldn't be your recommendation.
Well, you know, sometimes it's not. It's quite nice, isn't it? Moderation and everything. Let's start with some tinned fish. It's cheap. Whether it's sardines, whether it's salmon, it's good oily fish as well. It's got lots of nice omega fats in it. Mackerel. Tuna's okay. It's not fatty, but again, people enjoy it. Tinned fish is a good source of protein. Even tinned cod roe, you know, it's quite nice on a bit of toast. So I'd start there. You're then into your lean proteins in terms of meats, which are, again, chicken, good quality red meat. If you can afford to get grass-fed or organic, then do so. So buy what you can afford. I would have less red meat, but better quality. So if you fancy a steak, get a good quality one. and really enjoy it. Don't burn it to death, but make sure that you cook it nicely and really enjoy it. On the vegetable proteins, pulses are a good choice. Lentils, edamame beans, which you can buy frozen, very high source of proteins. Tofu, if you like tofu, not everybody does. It's a good source of protein. I'd say if you're having soy, go for the organic stuff, not the GMO stuff. So again, buy the best source you can afford. And tempeh is a great source of protein as well. You've got protein in some grains like quinoa. It's not a lot. Obviously got protein in eggs, not as much as you think, actually. So if you have an egg on toast for your breakfast, have 2, not 1, to get good protein intake there. So that's where I would go.
And what about supplements? We often see people in gyms, particularly with supplements of one sort and another. Some of them don't look particularly appetizing. What's your view on those?
You mean protein shakes?
Yeah.
Look, there's a place for them. And I do have clients that are looking to gain muscle. And what we try to do is to try and get food sources into their diet of protein, which you can do. But for example, some people can't tolerate a lot of eggs, and a lot of athletes like to mainline a lot of egg whites, but some people can't tolerate them. So they'll go to a protein shake. I think there's a place for good quality protein. If you're a cancer sufferer, I would stick to protein that had what I would call low growth factor sources, things like rice protein or pumpkin powder protein. If you're looking to gain muscle, a good grass-fed whey protein, which is a dairy-based whey protein, is a good thing to have. If you suffer with dairy, bone broth protein is quite helpful as well and is a good source of protein, but I wouldn't give that to a cancer patient. I'd stick to the vegetarian sources for there. But, sometimes if you're trying to keep muscle and you're on the move, protein shake's the best thing to get. But think carefully about the quality of it and where it comes from and what else you put in with it.
And presumably the sugar content, which can be quite high in protein shakes, can't it?
Yeah, if you make your own, you buy one that's kind of low sugar and then put your own fruit in, then, it's generally a good thing to have.
Okay, if we can summarise then, what I think you're saying is that for normal, healthy individuals, don't be too afraid of having a little bit more protein in your diet. Don't go mad, but tend to err on the side of having more rather than less. Is that fair?
Don't undereat it. One thing I probably would add, Terry, is that some people worry about kidney disease by eating too much. You have to eat a lot. If you do have a kidney disorder, you've already been told not to. But generally, you're not going to be eating heavy amounts of protein if you've got kidney disease. But I would say don't be frightened of it and make sure it's good quality and it's a mixture of animal and plant if you're an omnivore. If you're a vegetarian, it's harder to get good sources of protein, but it's not impossible.
Karen, great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on.
All right, thank you.
This month's BV magazine carries an article by Bedminster farmer and regular contributor Andrew Livingston about that very unsightly topic, fly tipping. I said to Andrew that I had the impression that fly tipping has increased in recent years and wondered what he thought.
Yeah, most definitely, I agree with that. And I mean, even the statistics that are released show that there's a trending rise as well. It's the real bane of the countryside, and I can't quite figure out why it's getting worse and worse. I know obviously that there are you have to pay to remove some things at your local tip, such as refrigerators, tyres, etc. But it's not even that kind of stuff that's being tipped. It's just people's bags of general rubbish that they just can't be bothered to take to the local recycling centre. I mean, in Bridport we have got a which is probably about 5 miles from our farm. There is an unbelievably good recycling centre which people just can't seem to be bothered to use. They just rather throw it out in the countryside and think that'll do.
But this doesn't really make sense, does it, Andrew? Because we have such good, household recycling collections now, don't we, from the council? That why would you even bother to have to go to the recycling centre or the tip to take stuff there? Because you can most of it taken away from your doorstep, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's honestly absolutely baffling. I don't know why people do it. It's so pointless. I know sometimes I've had it in the past where my rubbish has built up and built up, especially after having 2 children. But in most circumstances, you can apply to have a second bin, so there's not even any need to be letting your rubbish build up. Just have 2 bins, and they'll come and collect 2 bins.
But if you were to speculate, Andrew, as to why people are doing this increasingly, can you think of a reason?
Laziness might be a good excuse. People just not being bothered to do the job properly. In some instances, we have some cases of fly tipping that would come from commercial vehicles such as vans, etc. And I know that when a business van, such as like a builder or something, has to go to a tip, they have to pay to get their stuff recycled with them, unless you pay for a special license. So I guess in some cases people just think they'll save themselves the money by just dumping it out in the countryside. But as for just house waste, I don't know why people do it. It just seems pointless.
Who do you think mostly is doing the fly tipping?
It's hard to say. It's all done in the middle of the night, and I'll go to work in the morning, and then there's a new bag of rubbish, and there's a new pile of household waste. So it's a mix of everyone. You can't just solely blame it down on one person. I mean, to find out who's really doing it, we'd have to invest heavily in some serious CCTV and security all around the roads along our farm. But it's never going to happen.
Is it mostly farmers who are the victims of fly tipping? Farm gates and entrances to farmyards?
Everyone's the victim because everybody has to go out and look at it. Yes, it's solely dumped on the edges of bridleways or in fence lines where it looks like there's a bit of a ditch that something could be hidden in. But it's everyone that has to deal with it, because you go out for a nice stroll on a Sunday and there's an eyesore of a load of black bin bags and rubbish. Yeah, it's just not right. But I mean, I will say that predominantly, if it's a small case, we'll just pick it up and sort it ourselves. So that then majorly becomes our problem because we're having to deal with it rather than waste the council's time. But yeah, then on the bigger scales, when it comes to plasterboard and bits of building materials, we have to get the council in to come and sort it because we've got no way of removing that.
So when you refer to the other things that you sort, you mean you actually go through the contents of the bags and recycle what you can, do you?
As much as possible, yeah. It depends how much time we have available to ourselves, but predominantly we'll usually just put it in one of our black bins and dispose of it that way, because whoever dumped it off couldn't be bothered to do that themselves.
And Andrew, do other farmers do what you do?
Yeah, I would say that is predominantly the standard. Is just if it's just a small thing, pick it up and sort it yourself. And if it's a bigger issue, contact the council. But that then builds its own issues, because then I don't think anybody really realises how big the issue with fly tipping is, because it's not often being reported to the council for their statistics. It's kind of exactly the same as when it comes to sheep worrying. Quite often it just doesn't get reported because the farmer just wants to get on with his life and doesn't want to have to deal with the rigmarole of having to sit on the phone to someone.
So in a way, Andrew, you could say you're not helping yourselves as farmers by doing the council's job of sorting out the fly tipping for them.
No, but I'm sure the council have got lots of other things to get on with. So it's a case of doing our bit where we can. If the council were going to be, or if the police were going to get involved and start investigating properly who's doing it, then yeah, it would definitely be more productive to be handing it on to the proper authorities. But I think when it's just a random couple of bin bags every couple of months, we just have to not waste their time and sort it out ourselves.
And as you say, you've got your life to lead and your work to do, haven't you?
Yeah, that always has to come first. Unfortunately, we have to concentrate on the welfare of our animals rather than going through Mr. and Mrs. Robinson's rubbish, trying to look for some clues.
You're really being very good citizens then, because it must be most unpleasant to have to go through somebody else's rubbish.
Well, at the end of the day, we care about the countryside and we care about the environment. So we just have to feel as though we're doing our bit. I wouldn't say it makes us heroes, but I like to think that we always like to make sure that the countryside is appealing to everyone. I mean, where we farm is one of the most beautiful spots in Dorset, and I wouldn't want a tourist or a holiday maker's appearance of Dorset to be ruined by a local who's just dumped some rubbish.
Of course, Andrew, quite apart from the eyesore and that aspect, there is also the side issue that it could be potentially harmful to wildlife.
Oh yeah, most definitely. It's not good when you've got issue of hedgehogs, etc., going through bags of rubbish. I mean, hedgehogs have got enough to deal with on our road, trying to dodge cars without having to try and dodge harmful rubbish and waste. I mean, and you look at the rivers. I mean, it's the same issue with just littering. The amount of litter that ends up in our waterways that causes harm to animals and to the fish.
And of course, a lot of that washes off the land. But on a slightly more positive note, there is that you give the example in your article of the fact that not everything that looks like fly tipping in a farm gate is a fly tipping, is it?
No. We had a bit of a curious situation a few years ago where we had a contractor that was a friend of ours, and he was a building contractor, dump some rubble that he had from a building site because we wanted to build up one of our wet gateways just so it could be a bit drier for us to be able to get through with the tractor. And he dumped it on the Thursday, and we went on the Friday to move it around and spread it and roll it, and it disappeared. And it turned out a friendly walker had been kind enough to ring the council to inform them of some fly tipping, and it was removed very quickly.
So that was a case where you really could have done with that staying put, because this is a fairly common practice, isn't it, in the farming community, that a soggy gateway, or one that's quite deeply rutted and therefore the water pools in and the mud gathers, that rubble is very useful for solving that problem.
Exactly, yeah. It acts as a good soak away and gives a level playing field for the cattle to walk through without risking breaking any limbs through a horrific accident. So yeah, it was just a bit of mistaken identity on the rubble's part, and it then ended up as the council's problem. So we just had to then source some more rubble, but that wasn't too much of an issue. It's just a bit of a funny tale.
So you need a sign that says "Rubble welcome, fly tipping not."
Yes, yeah. Then I think the problem is we'd have about 50 tons of rubble by the next day. So best not advertise that too much.
No, because you need to be able to get through your gates, don't you?
Yeah, yes, yeah, and need to be able to see into the fields as well. Yeah, it really is a tricky one. I mean, most councils have started upping the fines for fly tipping and littering, but unless you're able to catch someone, it's kind of pointless, really. It's a bit of a waste of time. There's a fine line between having bins all around our countryside so that people can put their rubbish in a bin, but then you have to have the people to be able to go around and empty those bins. Otherwise, they just pile up and spread everywhere again. So, as I said, it is a fine balance to be able to get it right. But I think if everybody just upped their efforts by about 5%, our countryside would look a lot nicer. For example, when I go out for a walk with my dogs, I will often pick up bits of rubbish that I find along the way because I don't want someone else to have to walk past it and look at it. Or, as you say, animals having to try and use a empty packet of walkers as their new habitat. Well, if you look at the Japanese culture, they'll go to a sporting event, and then after the sporting event is finished, the fans will go through the whole stadium picking up the rubbish and taking it home. I mean, it's absolutely miles away from our attitude towards respect for others and taking accountability for your own mess. It's crazy.
That was Andrew Livingston on the unsightly topic of fly tipping. The forgotten art of hedgerow life cycles. With new incentives for sustainable farming, hedgerows are crucial, as Andrew Livingston found out when he talked to hedge expert John Calder. Hedges are the single most important ecological building blocks we have in the farmed landscape, creating corridors for wildlife. Those were the words of George Eustace, the former Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA. When you think of farmland, it can be easy to forget the hedge. For the farmer, it's not a commodity, unless you're a particularly keen blackberry picker. But for the wildlife of our countryside, it's a rich haven, a year-round food source and sanctuary for mammals, insects and birds. They are part of the farmed landscape, but the part that is not farmed, hedges escape the intensification of farming, said John Calder of the Great Big Dorset Hedge, the GBDH, which is trying to restore and extend the hedgerows of Dorset. People think of them as corridors, but that would only be correct if animals only walk, fly or burrow along them. It's not quite that way. But they are linked, so seeds will travel up and down hedges, and certainly bats find a big hedgerow useful to navigate against and fly along. Improving the network of hedgerows across Dorset will help support the biodiversity and protect against the effects of climate change. The first stage of this mission is being completed by an ever-growing team of volunteers who are out and about in the countryside surveying the hedgerows. Volunteers carry out one of two different surveys, public or private. The former is carried out along public footpaths. The GBDH team walks a footpath and surveys a hedgerow that may be alongside it. A private survey is carried out on a farm when the farmer has invited the team to come and survey the hedges. Recent alterations to farmers' government subsidy payments have increased the importance of hedge life to the farmer. The new scheme, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, or SFI, pays farmers not for the amount of land they own, but for actions that they take on their farms that will not only improve food production, but also grow food more sustainably. As an experienced enthusiast on hedges, John was invited by DEFRA to join the Hedgerow Practitioners Work Group during the creation of the SFI scheme. Within the Sustainable Farming Incentive, he says, there are 23 actions through which you can acquire funding, but 3 out of the 23 are hedges. Number 1, you need to do an assessment of the condition of your hedges. Number 2, you have to manage your hedgerows in a prescribed way that's environmentally friendly. And number 3, if you've got in-hedge trees in a frequency of at least 1 every 100 metres overall, there's some funding for that. So far, around 70 farmers have signed up to the GBDH to survey a significant block of the hedges on their farms. John says the farmers are motivated by the desire to do the right thing, but also the necessity of recovering some of that basic payment scheme through the SFI. All our reports are now written with the SFI hedgerow actions in mind. So what is a healthy hedge? Typically, it will take 3 volunteers an hour to survey 1 kilometre of hedge. During that time, they note the species present, the height and depth of the hedge, and, most importantly, the life cycle. The life cycle of a hedge is measured by the Adams Hedgerow Management Scale. The scale is named after Nigel Adams, a hedge-laying expert who was part of DEFRA's Hedgerow Practitioners Work Group with John. To understand the Adams Code, you need to understand a little about the history of hedgerow maintenance. John explains, if you go back before we invented flails on tractors and chainsaws and all that stuff that makes it easier to slaughter a hedge, you'd have a man walking along the hedge side with a staff hook, a long stem with a hook on the end, and he'd be trimming that hedge possibly every year. These days, that's not what happens. You've got a flail doing the job, and it's a very efficient tool. In the old days, says John, once the hedge was maybe 20 years old, it would become a little out of control, and then you'd relay it. Every time you lay a hedge, you invigorate the root systems to start some new growth. That would be more or less the start of a new cycle of that hedge. So, if you go back a few generations, they'd be laying hedges every year, but on different parts of the farm. And that means that there are hedges in different stages all over the farm. Turns out that's what's ideal for nature. When you look at hedges today, they can be placed under 4 categories of the Adams Code: tightly managed, rejuvenated, well managed, and finally running up. A tightly managed hedge would be one that's flailed with a hedge trimmer each year. Eventually this can cause damage to the hedge to the point it needs rejuvenation. Rejuvenation can come in the form of hedge laying, planting of new hedges, and coppicing, which is felling a tree at its base to create a stool from which new shoots will grow. Eventually, a rejuvenated hedge grows into a well-managed hedge, which, if then left unmanaged, will become a hedge which is running up, the best for carbon capture. They are the largest in size, but they'll begin to leave gaps in the bottom of the growth, so they eventually need to be rejuvenated again. And this is the life cycle of the hedge. The answer to a healthy hedge? John says the formula for a healthy hedge is the recognition and combination of each stage of the entire cycle that makes the perfect hedge. These days there are two quite different systems for managing hedges, he says. In one case, it's coming along with a flail and hitting it back at the same point at the same time every year. That's a tightly managed hedge. Ultimately, this will cause their demise because it's just too much pressure on the hedge for it to survive. On the other hand, you might have particularly well-meaning people who think that carbon capture is everything, so in order to mitigate against climate change, they decide, why don't we just let our hedges grow up and up and up and up, capturing carbon? That's now happening a lot in conjunction with rewilding, and it's not all good because you end up with a row of trees, and a row of trees is something that has merit in its own right, but it's not a hedge. At the bottom of a row of trees, you don't have that important dense cover for wildlife. The life cycle of a hedge may seem trivial, but John insists hedges have enormous importance and are an area where the farmer can make a relatively big impact environmentally without enormously affecting their financial operations. Alongside rivers, they are part of the landscape where the farming community can do the most, can really make a positive impact. The Great Big Dorset Hedge is always keen for more volunteers or farm hedges to come and survey. Head to dorsetcan.org to get involved. And with that, we come to the end of this first episode of the July 2024 BV podcast. We'll be back again towards the end of the month with our second episode, so do join us then if you can. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Jenny Devitt.
And until next time, it's goodbye from me, Terry Bennett.